invite onto the stage our first youth lead speaker, Ali Milani, who I've had the pleasure of working with, training with, and campaigning alongside. Ali Milani is a UK Labour Party politician, councillor and campaigner. He served 2 years as the Vice President of the National Union of Students, was elected as Labour councillor in 2018, and was also selected as a parliamentary candidate in Uxbridge and South Ruislip in September to run against Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. Please welcome onto the stage Ali Milani.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to first of all thank Sharq Forum for providing this opportunity to see all of you, to speak to so many people, particularly to the volunteers who make events like this possible. So I want you to put your hands together for each and every one of the volunteers who have made this possible today. I want us to think not just about the moment we're in, but the place that we're in today. We meet today in Istanbul, which for many of us represents a symbolic space, and that is the meeting of East and West. And it's about having the courage for us to reach out between different communities and different peoples, and particularly about having the bravery to unclench our fists and to open our hands. For me, meeting in Istanbul is not just a symbolic moment, but a personal, significant one. I was last in Istanbul 3 years ago. Weeks before a general election, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, I met my father in Istanbul to prepare for what would be a grueling general election. And as we sat down for a cup of tea, as we are prone to do, we got to talking about political life in Britain and my candidacy in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. And he said something to me that stuck with me to this day and is the reason why I tell my story around the world. He said that as I told the story of what was happening in Uxbridge and South Ruislip and in Britain, he saw the light of hope in my face. And he had teased me for years and years that his generation had usurped a king. And what was my generation going to do? Now that conversation would be significant because it would be the last conversation that I would have with my father. Merely months after that, he would pass away as a result of COVID-19, which I know is the experience of so many families. And it's because of the hope that he saw in my face and because of the light that he saw in my describing of the political journey that we had been on, why I am here today, to transfer that hope, to transfer that bravery, and to transfer that light to each and every one of your faces. Now, my story is a pretty unlikely one. I was born in Tehran, and my family would be refugees to London at the age of 5. And I would grow up in a council estate with a single parent who didn't speak a word of English. And it is that story that defined my politics, that defined my political journey. And as Zamzam mentioned, I would be privileged enough to go on to serve not only his 2 years as Vice President of the National Union of Students, but also the youngest candidate to take on a British Prime Minister in the history of British democracy. Now, the idea that we had when I decided to stand against Alexander de Pfeffel Boris Johnson, who some of you will know as Boris Johnson. It's funny because with a name like Alexander de Pfeffel Boris Johnson, I was the one that was told I had a foreign name, but it's okay. The idea behind my candidacy was a question of two things: political courage and the urgency of now. And those are the two things that I want to leave you with here today. We believed in that West London seat that if we could be the first candidacy to unseat a sitting Prime Minister in the history of the mother of all parliaments, then all things were possible. And yes, we weren't successful, but we came closer than anyone has in the history of British democracy to unseating a British Prime Minister. It was a 24-year-old Muslim who came closer than anyone else has ever come in the mother of all parliaments to unseating a sitting British Prime Minister. And yes, we may not have been successful in that campaign, but I take some reverence in the fact that I stand here, still standing before you, and in 20 days, he's going to be booted out of number 10. And so the two things I want to leave you with here today, the first is political courage. One of the biggest experiences and the biggest lessons that I learned standing against a prime minister was that it's easy to regurgitate what you think people already believe. I call this the politics of focus groups. You see politicians do it all the time. They focus group, they go out and see what people already believe, and they regurgitate it back to them. That's easy. It requires no skill, it requires no talent, and I guarantee you, there is a line outside this building ready and willing to do it. But those who have political courage, those are the real leaders. Those who are willing to take ideas that are unpopular and make them popular. Those who have the solutions to the multiple crises that face us and are willing to stand on stages like this and stages within your communities and make them popular. Those are the real leaders. And so, I often think that political courage comes with a necessary amount of naivety, of believing in the face of opposition, in the face of oppression, that you can do it too, that you can take these solutions and take these beliefs and make them a reality. And so, one of the things I want each and every one of you out of this conference to reject is cynicism. Cynicism is such a useless emotion. It's such a useless emotion because what it tells you is that things aren't possible. Well, let me tell you something. When I stood in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, they told me it would never be possible. They told me that a British Muslim could never stand against a British Prime Minister. And yes, all the right-wing media attacks came with it, and all the death threats came with it. I was the only candidate in that general election that had to have plainclothes police officers with me at every campaign event. But what I learned through the support of young people like you is that all things are possible. And so with that political courage, you can achieve anything. The second is the urgency of now. Believe it or not, I think I'm still young. The looks might not support that notion, but this is what a couple of years in British politics does to you. There is an impatience that comes with youth, an urgency to get things done now. And my brief interaction with establishment politics in Britain and across the world is they want to bury that impatience. They want to bury that urgency. And it's up to us, all of us, to keep that fire alive, the impatience for change. And we won't win it all. But if we believe and if we fight together with that urgency of change, we can change the world together. Linda so eloquently put it before me, better than I could. But the reality is, no one else is coming. We are all we have. This is it. But that's not something to be afraid of. Seeing the thousands of faces that I have just in the last couple of days, speaking to each and every one of you at this conference, I have more hope today that we are able to accomplish the amazing things that we dream of through the work of young people like yourself. So I want you to have that urgency for change. I want you to have that impatience that comes with youth. Look, the crises ahead of us are vast. There's no doubt about that. From the existential crisis of climate change to war in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa, the economic recession and the poverty that so many of our communities have to live with, and what we've learned most recently with the impact of global health and the pandemic. These crises are vast, but the only way that they will be challenged and met with the solutions that are radical enough that will meet the crises of our times is with the political courage and the impatience and urgency for change that comes with youth. So, if there's one thing you take away from this conference, if there's one thing you take back into your local communities, wherever you may be from, take this away. We have no more time for the establishment. We have no more time to let the Boris Johnsons, the Donald Trumps, and that era of politicians to run the world and to meet the crises of our times. There's no one else coming. We are it. And I want to end with this. Look, I was born in an inconspicuous hospital a little east of the center of Tehran. And if you told my parents that day that their son would grow up and in a few decades would stand shoulder to shoulder with the British Prime Minister and come 5% away from being the first person to ever to unseat a sitting Prime Minister, their reaction, rightly, would have been to check you upstairs to the psychiatric ward. That would have been a reasonable response. But our world cannot afford to have limits on our ideas anymore. We cannot afford to have limits on who can and cannot contribute to the political world. It is ours to take. They're not going to hand it to us. We have to take it. The crises of our times and the desperate situation within our communities demands a new generation of leaders. It demands for you to unleash your potential. And I want you to leave with this thought. If my unlikely journey can be possible, then unleashing your potential is entirely probable. And so go out with that political courage, with that urgency for change, and fight for the world that you believe in. And I promise you, we will all be there right beside you to fight with you. Thank you so much.